In this module, we're going to discuss one of the most fundamental card types in Star Wars CCG, characters. So what we have up on the screen here is a character card, Padme Nayberry, which we've seen in previous modules, but we're going to unpack the card more than we have previously, and really give you a good understanding of how character cards work and what all the different things on the card mean. So the first thing to draw your attention to, other than the title of the card, which is obvious and self-explanatory, is the power level here. So power, like it sounds, refers to how strong the character is. Higher power is better. Power 3 is pretty much middle of the road. If you look at Obi-Wan here and put him side by side with Padme, you can see he's power 5. He's a stronger character, that's to be expected. And if you look at, say, this will be a dark side character, but Greedo here is power 2. And if you remember, Greedo is the bounty hunter that confronted Han Solo in the cantina in A New Hope. So maybe you agree or disagree with the decision that he would be a weaker character than Padme is, but this is the way it is for the Star Wars CCG in any event. And most of the assignations of power to different characters should be pretty intuitive and in line with what you would expect from having viewed the Star Wars films. So the next thing to draw your attention to on Padme here is the ability. Ability 3. And ability refers to the character's level of attunement with the Force. So to go back to Obi-Wan here again for a second, Jedi are going to have the highest levels of ability. Obi-Wan is ability 6. He's very attuned with the Force. Padme is not too bad herself. Padme has ability 3. But then to bring back Greedo here, Greedo is considered very much not attuned with the Force. Greedo is sitting at a lowly ability 1, which is consistent with other weak-minded characters such as, for example, your run-of-the-mill Stormtrooper here, ability 1, and also coincidentally, just power 1. Stormtroopers are not considered very effective characters whatsoever from the point of view of Star Wars CCG. Now, ability 1 is as low as it gets for animate characters. If you are a living, breathing person or alien, you will have ability of at least 1. The only types of characters with ability 0 are droids. Droids are considered inanimate, and by the rules they have 0 ability. And so they don't even show that on the card. As you can see, the space where the ability would go on other character cards is missing here, because it's just understood in the rules. Very much like how locations are all Destiny 0, and so it's not printed, like we discussed in a previous module. The ability level of 0 for droids is not printed on the card. Okay, so back to Padme here. So that's her power and ability, kind of middle of the road for both of those. The other two really important numbers in terms of the character's fundamental stats are these two down here. The top one, this black 2 on the white background, is the character's deploy cost. In a previous module we talked about using Force and how the cards in your Force pile are the resources you have to use to do things during your turn. Well, specifically for characters, the deploy cost is how many Force you have to use in order to play that character to the table. So a lower deploy cost, of course, is better for you. The cheaper a character is to deploy, the more Force you have remaining to do other things with on your turn. Naturally, the way it generally works is that stronger characters have higher deploy costs, and weaker characters have lower deploy costs. So for example, if we go back to Obi-Wan here, Obi-Wan is stronger than Padme, both in terms of power and ability, and accordingly, Obi-Wan's deploy cost is higher. There are exceptions to that. It's not a hard and fast rule of how cards are designed. Sometimes a character with high power and high ability may have a relatively low deploy cost, but in general, that's the way it works. So then, that's the deploy cost. The other number here is the forfeit value. And what the forfeit value represents is how much damage the character can soak up, if you want to think of it in that way. A higher number is better for you. This will make a lot more sense when we are in the module where we're talking about battling and how battles work, but for now, just keep that in mind. The forfeit value is how much damage a character can soak up in a battle, and so a higher number is better for you. So to make Padme full screen here again, I just want to point out, with regards to ability, this box here is actually a redundant description of ability. From the very beginning of the game, characters of ability 3 were called Force Attuned, abilities 4 and 5 are Force Sensitive, and whatever the original intention of the designers was, this ended up being not necessary, and you can just ignore it. So finally, to come to the most important point about ability, what's the significance of it? It is relevant for battling. It's relevant in a few different ways, which we will see when we talk about battles. But for all of your purposes, at least in terms of all of the purposes for the fundamental rules of the game, higher ability is better. As I mentioned, sometimes maybe a card will target characters of ability less than 4 or less than 3 and give them certain bonuses. And so that can be a way that characters which are weaker in themselves can be viable to play, and you can have fun decks where you're using weaker characters, but again, there are these cards which then give them bonuses. But for general purposes, higher ability is better. The final number on the card is one that you're already familiar with, and that is the destiny number up here in the corner. As mentioned before, typically the way it works is that stronger cards will have lower destiny numbers, and weaker cards will have higher destiny numbers. And 3 is pretty much middle of the road. So other than the character's stats, certainly the most important thing about a character is the character's game text, which is right here. And this is the special things which the character can do. And so what Padme can do is twice per game may deploy Qui-Gon or Obi-Wan here from reserve deck, reshuffle. So with the understanding that you probably haven't seen too many Star Wars CCG cards yet, nonetheless, you can probably intuit that this is a pretty cool thing that she can do. Typically, you can only play cards that you have in your hand, and so being able to pull something out of your reserve deck and deploy it to the table, especially cards which are as strong as Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, that's a pretty neat ability. So even though Padme herself is not the strongest character at Power 3 and Ability 3, she has this really neat thing she can do. And then the second part of her game text here, while present with your Jedi at a site, opponent may not target Amidala with weapons. And so the intuitive sense of that as well should be pretty clear. When Amidala, it's another name for Padme, if you remember the films, she had an alias, but when Amidala is with the Jedi, they are protecting her, and so the dark side cannot target Amidala with weapons. So that's the game text. The other big chunk of text here, in between the title and the image, is called the lore, and this is just flavor text describing the character. And so it talks here about how Queen Amidala posed as one of her own handmaidens for added safety, etc. This is not generally consequential. However, sometimes there will be key words describing a character in the lore, and these will be in bold, generally. So, for example, Leia here, it says she is a leader. And so if there are cards which give bonuses to leaders, or if there are characters which need to be around leaders in order to do what they do because they need that kind of direction, the lore is where you will look to identify who are your leaders. To take another example, let's look at Greedo again. You can see that Greedo is identified in bold as a bounty hunter. Now, I said that key words will generally be in bold in the lore, and unfortunately, there is some variation around this, and this really just has to do with whether certain characteristics were premeditated to be significant or not. So, for example, one thing that is not in bold here is it says that Greedo is a Rhodian. That is his species, Rhodian, and I can zoom in if it's not. There you go. So you see Rhodian. When Greedo was originally made as a card, I suppose it was not thought that Rhodian would be a key characteristic, and so it was not put in bold. But at this point, there are some cards which target Rhodians, and so you'll have to look in the lore and look for that word Rhodian, even if it's not in bold. So finally, to go back to Padme here, the last thing I want to point out is you may have noticed this dot in front of her name. And this is what's called the uniqueness of the character. The dot tells you how many copies of the card you can have on the table at once. So one dot, you can only have one copy of the card out, and this makes sense, right? Padme is a specific person. It wouldn't make sense to have two or more copies of her on the table at once. And so she's called a unique character because she has one dot. There are also non-unique characters. So for example, a Stormtrooper here has no dots. You can have as many Stormtroopers out as you want. There's also intermediate ground between one dot and no dots. So for example, if we go back to the Baragwin, you can see the Baragwin has 3 dots. And so you could have up to 3 Baragwins on the table at once, no more. Baragwin is still considered non-unique. Only cards with 1 dot are unique. Anything else, whether it's 2 dots, 3 dots, or no dots, those are all non-unique cards. And just to make a point about it, I mentioned that, of course, Padme is unique because she is a specific person. There should only be one of her on the table at a time. Baragwin is not a specific person. This is a card representing a general member of an alien species. And so why is there a limitation? Why can you not just have as many on the table as you want, like with Stormtroopers? And this is really a gameplay thing. Because of what the Baragwin is able to do, it could become problematic for gameplay if you were able to have as many on the table as you wanted. And so sometimes that's the reason for restrictions and for giving a card a couple dots, 2 or 3 dots, rather than having it be completely unrestricted. It's sometimes more about the gameplay than about conceptually there needing to be a restriction in order for things to make sense. So those are the stats. We've looked at the numbers, we've looked at the text. Finally, there are these symbols on the card, right? So let's explain those. And these are not as important, but I just want you to feel like you have a general sense of what everything means. So first of all, in the upper left-hand corner here, this is the character's affiliation. So this is the symbol for the Republic. Padme is a Republic character. There are also rebels. If you see here, this is for Obi-Wan, the symbol of the Rebel Alliance. Obi-Wan is a rebel. Leia also is a rebel. You can see she has the same symbol as Obi-Wan. There are aliens, which will be this symbol here. Don't worry too much about this. There are not so many of these symbols that it is ridiculous, and they're really just a handful of key ones, and we've looked at alien and rebel, which are two of those. There are also Imperials, but it's not that difficult to absorb these quickly. A couple other symbols. This first one, directly beneath the destiny number, this is the expansion set that the character is from. So this was called the Tatooine expansion set, I can tell you, but this is hardly ever relevant. Don't spend a lot of time worrying about that. You certainly don't need to worry about memorizing the symbols for all the expansion sets. Below it, it's hard to see, and I think even if I zoom in, it's probably not, yeah, it's a high resolution scan, but not that high resolution. It says Episode 1, and so this just tells you that it's a card from Episode 1, as in the movie, Star Wars Episode 1. And this is also something that is sometimes relevant, but you don't really need to worry about it too much right now. And then the last symbol on here is this blaster rifle, if you can tell that it's a blaster rifle. And that is the symbol for a warrior. There are also symbols for pilots. So for example, Leia here is a pilot. This lightsaber means that she has a built-in weapon. So there are a few symbols like that. You don't really need to worry about those too much right now either, but just so you know that those are out there. And I guess we can point it out even though it is completely irrelevant, but this text here is just the copyright information on the card. Copyright 2001 Decipher Incorporated, copyright Lucasfilm, of course. That has no bearing whatsoever. And so with that, you now have a very good understanding of character cards.